Saturday Agenda.
Hello and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Peter van Onselen. Well, we're going to talk today first up about the carbon tax. You won't be surprised. It's going to dominate the weekend. Tomorrow we've got the lock-up for journalists out of Canberra, where they'll be able to get given the full details of the package in a closed environment, if you like, where the government can take the journalists through why they think this is a noble package and worthy of support. And after that, the journalists will be out. We'll all hear the Prime Minister offer her vision of it. The Greens leader will do the same. And, of course, the opposition will take on the carbon tax once we now have the full details, as they've been doing for a number of months now since the last election. To start on this issue, as well as to discuss some of the events of the week and what's making news in the papers today, I'm joined out of Perth by the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Matthias Cormann. Senator Cormann, thanks for your company.
Good morning, Peter. Good to be here.
Can I go straight to a story that's on the front page of The Australian? PM seals tax with pension windfall. Now, we reported on this as a leak some months ago. It's now looking like it's been confirmed on the eve of the full detailing of the carbon tax. The Prime Minister is looking to provide an upfront payment to more than, well, just under 2 million pensioners of $210 a year. You have to acknowledge that that's going to be a hard thing for you guys to campaign against.
Well, I mean, no amount of increase in the pension that's on the table apparently now is going to be adequate to compensate pensioners for the hit that they're going to face once the government pushes ahead with its carbon tax. I mean, the Prime Minister can't provide a guarantee to pensioners that pensioners will not be worse off under her carbon tax. We can provide that guarantee. Pensioners will not be any worse off on the direct action plan policy from the coalition, of course. And we've got to remember, we've got a Prime Minister who doesn't care about pensioners. We've got a Prime Minister who in Cabinet argued against pension increases when the coalition shamed the government into it a little while ago. And of course we've got a Prime Minister who before the last election promised that there would be no carbon tax under the government she leads, and now she's trying to make people believe that somehow pensioners are not going to be worse off under the government she leads once she's implemented the carbon tax. This Prime Minister has got a serious issue with her credibility. People can't believe the commitments she makes.
Well, let's go specifically, though, to this upfront windfall, $210 a year. Is that something that the coalition will maintain, or will you scrap it if you get into government?
Look, I mean, we'll obviously, in the lead up to the next election, make judgments on the basis of what the budget position is at the time. As far as pensioners are concerned, we can absolutely guarantee that pensioners will be no worse off under the coalition's direct action policy. And of course, I mean, we've got to just realise here we're talking about $4 a week, which is not going to be adequate compensation for pensioners in the context of rises in electricity prices, rises in general cost of living costs, whether it's groceries, whether it's power, whatever it is. I mean, this is not going to be adequate to compensate pensioners for the impact of the carbon tax. I mean, we haven't seen any of the detail yet. What we've got at the moment is a leak. So let's just see what is actually in the package tomorrow, and then we'll make our statements once we know what the government is actually doing.
Okay, you and your leader, and indeed most of the coalition, have been railing against the carbon tax. Now, the carbon tax is a fixed price on carbon, which will transfer in a few years' time to an emissions trading scheme. That's the package that has been put up by Julia Gillard. Now, in your maiden speech, you said that the government, you're talking about the Howard government when you came into the Senate in 2007, the government's recent announcement of a national emissions trading scheme, including offsets for trade-exposed industries, is a positive and sensible approach to addressing global warming. Why then, but not now?
And I absolutely did say that. And at the time, the coalition was in favour of an emissions trading scheme. But like the world changed in Copenhagen, Peter. At that stage, we all thought that the United States would have an emissions trading scheme by 2010, that China would have an emissions trading scheme by 2015. The government's own modelling in 2008 assumed that the US would have an emissions trading scheme by 2010. We now know they won't. It assumed that countries like Russia, Japan, Canada and so on would have emissions trading schemes by 2010. They don't. So, I mean, all throughout 2009, you would well remember, Peter, that the coalition argued that we should not be passing emissions trading scheme legislation before Copenhagen. And the reason was that we needed to find out what other countries around the world, what our trade competitors around the world were prepared to do in terms of pricing carbon. Once it became obvious that Copenhagen was a failure, once it became obvious that nearly all of our trade competitors were unprepared to go down the path of an emissions trading scheme or to go down the path of a carbon tax, it was in the national interest for us to rethink our policy approach. Because, I mean, we've got to always remind ourselves the objective here. The objective is to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, and for Australia to make the best possible contribution to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, when countries around the world obviously are not prepared to go down the path of emissions trading or down the path of a carbon tax, if we do it in Australia without our trade competitors...
Let me just say this, though. The European Union has a trading scheme. A large swathe of states, a growing number of states in the United States have trading schemes. New South Wales has had one under Bob Carr as Premier. So what's wrong with the federal government going down that path? When Howard was advocating it, you advocated it in your maiden speech. Indeed, Tony Abbott wrote an opinion piece in favour of it.
Well, I mean, firstly, I would reject the assertion that there's a growing number of states in the US that are having trading schemes. That's just not correct. And you can't compare the European scheme with what is on the table here in Australia. The European scheme, you've got to remember, the European scheme covers 30 European countries, represents about 14% of global emissions. That is 10 times as many emissions as we put into the atmosphere here in Australia, where it's 1.4%. Yet the European scheme has raised about between $2.5 and $2.9 billion over the last 6 or 7 years. The Australian scheme would raise in 3 months what the whole of Europe has raised in the last 6 or 7 years. So, I mean, what is here on the table from Julia Gillard, who promised us that there would be no carbon tax under the government she leads, is way worse and way more high impact than what is currently in place in Europe. And of course, but I mean, and leaving that aside, most of our trade competitors, China, India, the US, and so on, there's absolutely no foreseeable prospect of any of them putting either an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax in place.
But when they do, the coalition would look to move rapidly to an ETS?
Well, I mean, what we've said all along, I mean, we would obviously reassess our policy response to climate change. And that's what we've said at the time. I mean, there is no likely prospect.
Though, does that make direct action essentially a band-aid between now and when or if other powers the world over decide to move to an ETS?
No. Direct action is the most effective thing that we can do in Australia now to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason, Peter, is because direct action reduces emissions in Australia in a way that reduces emissions globally. Whereas the government's carbon tax or an ETS will reduce emissions in Australia to the extent it will in a way that just shifts emissions and shifts jobs overseas. It reduces emissions in Australia in a way that increases emissions in other parts of the world, arguably by more.
Let me ask you then, I mean, this argument, Tony Abbott appeared on the ABC 7:30 program during the week. He was questioned about whether or not there was any credible economists that support his direct action scheme. Now, there didn't appear to be. He certainly didn't respond by naming any. Can you name any?
Well, look, I mean, we obviously have to make our judgments on what we think is the best policy response for Australia in the circumstances where our trade competitors are not going down the path of imposing an economy-wide carbon price. Our trade competitors, the US is going for direct action, India, China, all of the countries where the government is saying, look at them, they're doing something, they are all going for direct action. So clearly, direct action is the policy response of choice for countries around the world that we tried and compete with, and it is right now the most appropriate policy response for Australia. Who knows what happens down the track, but right now, as then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said very colourfully, Copenhagen was a failure. There's now no foreseeable prospect of an appropriately comprehensive global agreement on pricing emissions. So Australia has got to put its policy response in place in that context.
But Senator, there's a lot of fudging going on here by the opposition, isn't there, surely? I mean, when Tony Abbott was asked that question about whether he could name a credible economist in this country that backed his scheme, he answered, I can certainly name a very credible organisation, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, probably the most reputable economic lobby group in our country, he said, which prefers our plan, that's your direct action scheme, to that of the government. Now, that's not right, is it? I mean, Peter Anderson on this network last Sunday made it quite clear when asked to compare the carbon tax to direct action that he didn't have a preference. He had a concern with both of them. What was Tony Abbott, your leader, doing fudging that?
Well, I think you're verbaling Peter Anderson here. I've read very carefully the transcript of his interview, and that is not quite what he said. I know for certain that the Chamber of Commerce and Industry is not in favour of the carbon tax. I mean, whatever the Chamber's views are in terms of all of the alternative policies that are on the table, I'm confident that the Chamber would prefer direct action to a carbon tax. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry...
Though, Senator, he had an opportunity when I interviewed him. He was asked, does he have a preference between the two? And he said not necessarily. He then said we know that there are a range of direct action mechanisms being introduced at the state government level which are quite inefficient. When he was asked does he have concerns on behalf of business with Tony Abbott's direct action plan, he replied, well, we do. We think that the right approach for Australians is to calibrate our action on carbon pricing with international action, and direct action or emissions trading or carbon taxes in the abstract all add costs. There was no favouritism of one scheme or the other there.
Well, and the reason the coalition is proposing a fully costed, fully funded and capped direct action policy is exactly because we do agree that we've got to calibrate our response in Australia with what happens in other parts of the world. Direct action is the policy of choice of countries like the US, like China, countries that we directly compete and trade with. And of course, the government is trying to have its cake and eat it too. They're trying to point to action in other parts of the world, but then are not prepared to concede that they're not going down the path of emissions trading or carbon taxes, that they are going down the path of direct action. And of course, what the Prime Minister has to tell us on Sunday is by how much electricity is going to go up by as a result of a carbon tax, by how much the price on carbon is going to go up, which we believe is going to double once the carbon tax changes its name from a carbon tax to an emissions trading scheme. There's a lot of questions the Prime Minister will have to answer on Sunday, and in particular, how many jobs will be lost as a result of her carbon tax?
Well, I'll get an opportunity to put some of those questions to government representatives tomorrow out of Canberra, but now that I've got you here, just as one final question on this direct action scheme, which is the coalition's alternative, we're talking about billions of dollars of taxpayers' money which would go into so-called direct action. Can I ask, from another perspective, why bother? Why bother putting billions and billions of taxpayers' dollars into so-called direct action when all your target for 2020 is a 5% reduction in emissions, and that is Australia's emissions, which only make up 1.4% of global emissions? Now, cutting by 5%, the minuscule figure of 1.4% of global emissions, frankly, at the tune of billions and billions of dollars, whether you're talking about your scheme or a carbon tax, strikes me as a little bit absurd and a bit of a waste of money.
Well, what is a waste of money is what the government is proposing to do, which is to reduce emissions in Australia in a way that will increase emissions by more in other parts of the world. That is forcing. Yeah, sure. I'm going to get to that. But like what the government is proposing to do is to force people in Australia to make a sacrifice by paying more for their electricity, by putting their jobs at risk, just to shift emissions into other parts of the world. Now, our scheme, of course, we've got a bipartisan target in Australia. The bipartisan target is that we want to reduce emissions by 5% on 2000 levels by 2020. And we will reduce emissions. We will achieve that 5% reduction by planting more trees, by better soil management, by smarter technology, cleaning up coal-fired power stations, something that's been completely ignored by this government so far. And we will reduce emissions in a way that presents a net reduction in emissions globally. Now, of course, any effort in Australia is going to be proportionate to our importance as part of overall emissions in the world. Of course, we can't reduce emissions in the world by 20% when we only represent 1.4% of emissions. But the beauty about direct action is that it will actually deliver a net benefit for the world.
All right, Senator Cormann, we'll let you go. We appreciate you joining us on Saturday Agenda. Thanks for your company. When we come back, we'll take a commercial break now, but when we come back, we're going to take a look at gender in the law, the number of women that are, in fact, going into partnerships and so forth within the law. My wife actually spoke to the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Elizabeth Broderick, a little bit earlier in the week. Back in a moment.